have now a China increasingly likely to take the island by force. And if that does happen, we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to prevent it? We didn't do enough to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. And there are many people privately saying we could have done more. Now's the time to start thinking about what is going on with Taiwan.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year put people's focus back onto Britain's influence around the world. Are we equipped to face up to the challenges lying ahead? The government has been warned that when it comes to the impact of a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it can't. Not only is there a defence question hanging over the UK approach to tensions in the region, there's an economic one too, with senior officials warning we're unprepared for the catastrophic economic consequences that would result. Well, Tobias Ellwood is a Conservative MP and chair of the Defence Select Committee. Tobias joins us now. Good morning, Tobias.
Good morning to you.
Thanks for joining us this morning. You visited Taiwan earlier this month and came back with the warning against UK economic dependence on China. Is the government taking this threat seriously enough?
Well, I'm pleased to hear that the government is thinking about this. We've seen reports that you just mentioned. The consequences of China taking Taiwan would cause such a global shock, the equivalent to that of COVID and the invasion of Ukraine combined. We've learned the hard way the importance of grain exports from Ukraine. For Taiwan, it's semiconductors. The world relies on Taiwan for 60% of all its semiconductors, 90% of the advanced ones. The global impact on trade, supply chains, you then have sanctions, retaliatory sanctions by China. This would be profound. And you mentioned the fact that I did visit the country. It was clear tensions are rising. China's long wanted control of this island for decades. But the feeling is now that the tensions are escalating. And this is only going in one direction. That was reflected in the 70 sorties, I think, over Taiwan's buffer zone space over the weekend. And President Xi is developing a superpower military capability. He now has the largest armed force in the world, not tested in war yet, but nevertheless. 20 years ago, it was the same size as Britain's. Today, it now challenges the United States. And he is increasingly dominating the South China Sea and consolidating not only domestic control, but actually internationally, he's becoming more aggressive and more assertive. But yet, the West continues to be, I'm afraid, risk averse. And China is watching what's going on in Russia, and still we're not doing enough. We've got NATO, this formidable military alliance, but formally benched, unable to support Ukraine, despite further attacks, indeed, on Kherson today.
Tobias, you mentioned that China's army has over 2 million active military personnel. The UK doesn't have a tenth of that. What would the UK and allies need to do to join forces if it wanted to actually face down China on it?
Well, you're absolutely right that we can't do this alone. We don't really have a NATO for the South China Sea area. And I think that's what we now need to consider, is bringing together like-minded nations that want to support the freedom of movement of trade and to make sure that there is security in that area. China has its eyes on a huge area of maritime space, the 9 dotted line as it claims, and it is building fortresses out of tiny unmanned islands as we speak, and nobody has challenged that. We're all coming to this very, very late indeed. Indeed, we are still in denial. There are so many of us that believe that we're so perhaps entwined into economic reliance on China that we can't stand up to China. But as I say, this is all going one way. And President Xi, if he fulfills his promise, the impact would be huge. This would be an ideological win for him over democracy. It would further inhibit critical international shipping lanes in that area that's vital for global trade. And it would give China momentum to no doubt further its authoritarian momentum. But most of all, and I stress this, is China's strategic ambitions of gaining control over that major economic power base, those semiconductors that Taiwan provides.
There are certainly echoes of Ukraine here. And we've all seen, haven't we, the impact of the war in Ukraine on our energy bills every week now when they go up, and the impact on other bills and inflation of what the war in Ukraine has done. What would be the economic impact to us here in Britain of an invasion of Taiwan by China?
Well, we need to disentangle ourselves now from connections with China, because if that invasion takes place, you can imagine, go through in your own mind what would then happen. The world would respond with our own sanctions. China would then retaliate. Don't forget, China owns a third of all of maritime movements. It actually owns or has part ownership of ports from Zeebrugge to Haifa to Piraeus,
Yeah.
even Felixstowe as well.
What would those sanctions look like, Tobias? What would they look like?
Well, that I don't know. You'd have to speculate as to what they might be, but certainly it would be akin to what we've seen with Russia to try and close down certain aspects to change China's behavior. But China is so big, it's become rather independent in that sense, but also has a grip of countries across the world through its One Belt, One Road programs. So many dozens of countries, including Commonwealth countries, are tied into programs that they can't very well stand up to China now. Because of that. So that means you're going to turn ourselves into another Cold War, an economic situation whereby the world would move into a new era of insecurity. These are really difficult questions for us to actually contend with. But you're now seeing the United States say that the buildup of what China's aggression looks like an invasion, or it could take the island by force in the next few years. We need to be asking these difficult questions today.
Yeah, and to understand the problem, you've got to understand the history of the problem as well. I mean, Taiwan has a complicated history, moving from independence to Dutch, Chinese, Japanese rule. Why do so few countries recognize Taiwan as an independent state today?
Well, for that very reason that you touch on, it is complicated. The fact that during the Civil War in China, this was where the Kuomintang moved to, and for decades, in fact, we didn't recognize the communists. It was, in fact, those in Taiwan that took the seat at the United Nations that also riled the Chinese Communist Party as well. So we come out with this sort of one China policy, which recognizes that Taiwan is in a different place, but that it's not a separate country in its own right. But when I visited there, you have a thriving democracy. You have such an important economy that's engaged in the international community. It has its own armed forces, but as I say, you have now a China increasingly likely to take the island by force. And if that does happen, we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do to prevent it? We didn't do enough to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. And there are many people privately saying we could have done more. Now's the time to start thinking about what is going on with Taiwan, because it isn't just Taiwan. This is dealing with China, a country that economically, technologically, militarily is going to overtake the United States, does not fit into our international rules-based order, indeed enjoys exploiting it for its own benefit, not played by those international rules.
Tobias, I really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee.